Hi, it's Sandra from SandraD Imagery. I'm going to share the breakdown, thought process, and workarounds for this image, which was inspired by a shoe and a nursery rhyme. Can you guess which one? It is a combination of my own photos, AI elements, a dash of fun and imagination. Let's dive in and have some fun with this image. This is my base photo taken in Tuscany, and I knew I wanted to capture this foreground to use as a composite down the track. I wasn't worried about the sky because I knew that I would replace the sky when I was creating a composite. I photograph for composites as opposed to the big vista landscapes now. I'm always looking for foregrounds, backgrounds, and elements to stock up my creative stash, and they're there ready to use when I'm wanting to feel creative. Why I love this foreground is I love the green and I love the patterns that are in the wheat field. But it's also got what I call negative space, which means that I can put the elements where I want to position them. I don't have to work around trees or other objects in a foreground or background. Let's dive in now and see how I created this image. With this image, I experimented on a few new techniques. I created this a number of years ago. My first layer that I did, I used a blur gallery to blur the landscape or the horizon. I'll turn the layer on and you can just see that it's just softened this area here. And I wanted that because I wasn't sure at this point what kind of sky I was going to put in. The next is where I do replace the sky, and this is where I've got it in a group. I'll turn that layer on, and this is the sky that I've chosen, one of my own photos. And the reason that I wanted this sky was for the drama, and it's working on what I call a contrast colour to the green. You've got warm colours in the foreground, the yellow, green, and then the blue is the complementary colour, and it adds some drama and mood to that overall composite. Next is where the hero comes in. It's the shoe. And I love this shoe. It's a Converse, and I think it's so quirky. And it really gives me an idea now what I can do and build up. I'm going to disable this mask now, and you can actually see that's how it was sitting into the wheat field. But using Photoshop brushes and masking, I've done some what I call disguise the grass and let it look like it was sitting in that wheat field. Now, as I mentioned before, I was experimenting with some new techniques. I look at this image now and I think, I could have done a better job on the grass brushing in, but that's all part of the learning curve. This is where I've stopped and looked at my image, and I love the blue sky, the moodiness, the green foreground, and the shoe. They're complementary colours that work together, but the red shoe is quite dominant in its red. And so I've made a conscious colour choice to actually dial down the red. And the two layers that I've done that is the curves and levels with a clipping mask. I'll turn the next layer on, and that's the curves, and that's dialed down those reds. Then I've added hue and saturation with a clipping mask, which is attached to the curves, and I'll turn that layer on. Now it's got what I call those soft tones that blend together colour-wise, and it's not as strong in the red colouring, but that's a personal choice. The next is where I start adding an element and the path, because I had an idea, and this is where I was going to use this photo to cut the footpath out or the boardwalk and place that in the image. I'm going to enable the mask, and you'll see that's where the path is. And I thought it just gives that nice little lead into what I had as in my imagination is a door. I've done some brushwork on the actual edging of the boardwalk, and I did struggle with that a little bit because I didn't have the right brushes. And it's important to get a lot of Photoshop brushes, grass, different foliage, so that you can try different blend techniques. Now, when I looked at the boardwalk, I felt it was a bit too bright, so I've done the next layer as a levels clipping mask and I've dialed that down. My next layer is a window, photographed somewhere in Norway. And again, I photographed purely for an element. When I saw these windows, I knew that I had to photograph them and put them in my creative stash. It was a little bit bright. Again, I've used a curves with a clipping mask just to tone that down. The next element is a door that was photographed somewhere in my travels, and I love it because it's just got this old world feel with a lace curtain. Again, I thought it was a little bit bright. I've used a hue and saturation with a clipping mask, and now it just gives it a little bit of a lightness, but it's soft and it doesn't over-dominate. I did another curves with a clipping mask, and you'll see now I've just given it a little bit of pop. Now I'm looking and thinking, what do I need to put in this? And in my mind, my vision was to create a shoe house. I didn't have any photos that I could put and sit on top of the shoe. I tried a number of photos and it just didn't work. So I went to my stash and I put this tower in. Now I'll turn this layer on and I love it. It's so quirky. It sits within the shoe. It just adds another dimension. It's an AI element, but I'm going to disable the mask and you can actually see what I call the tower. And there it is. So it's about repurposing different elements or photos that you may not have the right component, but you can, with a little bit of disguise work and mask, you can brush away the elements that you don't want. I took away this string line here. I just felt for me that was a distractor. And then I brushed out the base of the tower. Let's enable the mask again. And you can see it's sitting there. Fits in so well within the storyline. I've done a levels as a clipping mask just to give that a little bit of light. Let's turn that layer on and off. Now, what you can see up at the top of this, there's a black space. And what I've done is extended the canvas. And I did that early in the piece because I knew that there was not enough negative space in the image. I fixed that up later on in my workflow. Now I stop and look at the image and think, am I happy with all the elements? And yes, now it's what else can I add to this? I went into my creative stash and had a look and I thought I'm going to add some foliage to make it look like it's a house someone's living in. I felt that was a bit too bright in the green, so my next layer is what I call colour toning, and it's using the blur average technique. I'll just turn this layer on and it is a clipping mask and you can see it is very subtle. Now what you can do to get that effect is you'll go up to filter, blur and average, and what Photoshop does is works out the average colour of that layer underneath and it comes up with that colour. I didn't choose that colour and it just blends it in. The next layer is where I did a levels of a clipping mask. I'll turn that layer on. And all I'm doing is just adjusting that green that's underneath. Underneath is the ivy. So these three layers are about toning this ivy in. Let's move up to the layer stack. And this is where I had some fun. I noticed that there was a little telescope there. And I thought, why not? I'm going to put a rat in as though he's looking through that little telescope there. And just, it's a little gem, and it's my quirky style where I'll put little elements like that into some of my composites. I felt it was a bit dark, so we needed a little bit of a lift. I've done a curves with a clipping mask. I'll turn that layer on. It just gives a little bit of brightness. So I just grab the mid-tone and I drag that up or down depending on what I want to do. Now I look at the image and I think over on the right hand side, there's negative space. And I think there could be something there. I wasn't sure. Again, I went into my creative stash and I had a look what I had, and then I added the bird cage. And why I added that in, to me, I felt it gave a balance to the overall composition of the shoe house. It's a bit dark, so I've done a levels with a clipping mask just to give it a little bit of a lift. Turn that layer off and on. Now what I'm going to do is add a shadow. Now I'm known for not putting shadows in my images, but this one I thought I'm going to put a shadow in and I'm going to practice some skills on that. I'll turn that layer on and off. It's on a blank layer. I've done some brush work and some shadow work. There's many ways in Photoshop that you can add shadows, and all I did was just a little bit of brush work, low opacity, and I've just brushed in what I thought would be a contact shadow from the shoe. Now when I look at it, I think, oh, it just needs a little bit of lift. My next layer is where I use a grey layer and I do my dodging. I'll turn this layer on and off. Now, whenever I'm doing dodging or burning, I always work on a non-destructive layer, which is a grey layer. It's a technique that I learned a few years back and I still use it today whenever I'm dodging or burning. Now I look at the image and I think there's a lot of negative space over there on that left-hand side. What can I put in there that'll just fill in that negative space? I tried a tree on the horizon. I tried a few other elements in the foreground and it just wasn't working for me. It became too busy. They were distractors. And for me, it's about the shoe house. So I went into my creative station and thought, what am I looking for? And sometimes by going into my creative stash, I'll just look at my cutouts, my digital art, my AI elements, and sometimes I'll see something which sparks an idea. And so this is why I put the next element in. It's a telegraph pole, and I thought that actually works. To me, it just seems to fit in with the scene of a shoe house, and it needs electricity. I'm going to put this in. I did a levels on the next layer because I felt it was a bit flat on the light. And what I tend to do is I'll open up the properties and it's the midtones that I work with just to give a little bit of a lift. Now I added the second pole in because I thought that gives what I call the receding leading line into the background. And I had to work on the perspective of that second pole just to make it a bit smaller. Now what I'm going to do is take another look and think, well, I've just got two poles sitting in the foreground. What can I do? Is there anything else? I know I'm going to go into my Photoshop brushes and I'm actually going to use a brush that has birds sitting on telegraph or lines. And I thought, yes, that's exactly what I'm after. Now, does it tell part of the story? Yes, it does. But what I felt it gave the balance. I had the two poles, that there was no connection between the two poles until I put this Photoshop brush in, the birds sitting on a wire. Now I've got all my elements in place. It's all about colour grading. The next layer, I'll turn that layer on, and this is where I used a preset from Camera Raw. But what I've also done is fixed up the top of the image where that black band is to extend the sky. I'll turn that layer on and you can see now the total shift in colouring. Now, when I look at it, I think, oh, I'm not too happy with that. But again, it's the base on my colour grading. Let's go to the next layer. And this is where I did a Gaussian blur. I'll turn the layer on and off. Now, why did I use Gaussian? Is I felt this was a bit strong, a bit sharp. By putting a Gaussian blur over this layer, it just softens it down a bit. Turn that layer on again, and to get the Gaussian blur, you'll just come up to Filter, Blur, choose Gaussian blur, and this is where you choose what radius. I had it on a 1.9. You could go even further down. It just depends what you want. I wanted it to be soft. So I'll just cancel out, and that's what I've got. I've got that softness coming across that image. But by putting the Gaussian blur on, it flattened the image. So I did another grey layer, and I did a little bit of dodging just to give a lift on the shoelaces. I'll turn that layer off and on. What I also noticed by putting that Gaussian and that cinematic preset, it flattened the colours of my poles and the birds. I'll turn this layer on and off, and what I did was duplicate the layer with the brushwork of the birds. Now it's got some depth. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, oh, I'm not happy with the colouring. Let's see what else I can do with this. The next layer is where I use a gradient. I'll turn that layer on and off. And it's now given some blue into that overall colour. To get the gradients, my gradient's over here on the left-hand side. But if you click on that, you'll get these that are included in Photoshop. There's a number of colours that you can choose from in the gradients. You've got oranges, you've got greens, you've got blues. I generally tend to work with the greys or neutrals, but if I was working on a landscape that I wanted a little bit more of an orange or pink colour, I would definitely work with these gradients. I'll close that panel down, and this is why I've chosen the blue gradient. I turn that layer off. I felt it was flat and it just needed a little lift and a little bit more blue because the sky was looking washed out. I'll turn that layer on, and there it is. I've used the blend mode soft light and I've used the opacity at 40%. If I put that straight up to 100%, that really throws out what I call the colour shift. And this is where I experiment with the opacity. My next layer is a stamp visible layer, and I'm thinking I'm nearly there, but it looks a bit soft. What can I work with? The next layer is where I put film grain, and I used Nik software for this, but you could add noise. There's a number of programs where you can add film grain or noise into your images. I'll turn that layer on. Now by adding that film grain, just gives a little bit more depth in the colours, but they're still in vintage tones. And for me, it's my style. And I was experimenting with colour when I first created this a number of years ago. I'm generally happy with the colour and the tones. But once I looked at the image, I felt that the shoelaces and the top of the shoe had lost a little bit of brightness. I worked on a grey layer with some dodging. I'll turn that layer on. You can see I've just dabbed in some white or dodging in different areas. I'll turn that layer off and on. So it's about what I call dab the light to get the viewer to look through the image. Even though it's subtle, it just can lead that eye through. My next layer is where I've done a hue and saturation. I'll turn that layer on. So what I've actually done is desaturated the colours. With my colour grading, I build up the colours, but I will constantly desaturate and then build up. And this is what gives the colour depth through my images. Let's open up the property box and see what I've done. I've done a -26. Again, it's a personal preference. It's also about you playing with the saturation and seeing what you can create with that. My next layer is a stamp visible layer, but I've also done a merged layer where I've combined levels. What do I mean by that? Normally, when I'm working with levels or curves or hue and saturation, I'll come up to my adjustments panel just up here. Now, when I use those adjustment layers, I will always get a mask, and that allows me to mask or brush off any of the elements that I don't want. But on this layer, I've decided that I'm going to use another technique, which is merge layers. And to do that, you'll come up to where you've got image, and then you'll go adjustments, and then you can choose levels, curves, or exposure. With this technique, it's destructive and you don't get a mask. So, for example, if I click on levels, you will just see another layer and you can make those adjustments, but you can't undo them or you can't work with a mask. Now, why did I use this on this layer? Remember, I was saying I was experimenting and I thought I'd play with that. Let's turn that layer off and on, and you can see it's just given a lift. But what I've also noticed now is that it's flattened a little bit of the colours. So my next layer is where I've used an action, and it's called soft pop, and it's like a luminosity mask. You could do this same technique with using a curves, even a levels. There's a number of plugins that you can get with luminosity masking. I'll turn that layer on, and all it's done is given a shift into the light tones. It's just given it what I call a subtle pop. I stop and I look at my image now and I think I've lost those beautiful clouds. So what I'm going to do is a blank layer. I'll turn that layer on, and I used a Photoshop brush, and I've just brushed in some clouds or dabbed in clouds. I'll turn them off and on. And the reason that whenever I'm using a Photoshop brush, I always do it on a blank layer, because I can adjust the position of these clouds, for example. I'm going to click on my transform tool or Control T, and you can see now it's selected that area, and I can reposition those clouds wherever I want. I'm going to not accept those changes, but let's have a look to see, is there a blend mode? Have I changed the opacity? Because it's on a blank layer, I could use a blend mode to put soft light in. I could even dial down my opacity, but I've left it at that normal and 100%. Layer 16, we're at the end now. I had fun creating it. It was about trying new techniques, experimenting, seeing what I could create with my imagination. The inspiration came from the shoe. The ideas were just building up a shoe house and adding the elements, a combination of my own photos, AI elements, and colour grading. There's one other little trick that I sometimes do at the end of my workflow, and I just see what it does to the composition. Now, I look at the image and I think, I wonder, if I flip this image, what would it look like? To do that, let's go up to Image, choose Image Rotation and flip Canvas Horizontal. Might take a little while because this is a large file. And what it does is changes the composition. And sometimes I'll do that at the end of my workflow just to give a different look. What do you prefer? The shoe on the left-hand side or the shoe on the right-hand side? It's a personal choice. For me, it's about having fun, playing and experimenting with ideas and techniques to create the vision that I have in my imagination. If you would like to learn the basic skills of composite imagery, I have a composite bundle with 4 videos breaking down the skills you need to start your composite journey. The link for my website is in the description. Thank you for watching and have fun being creative.